They thought they were untouchable. A group of HOA board members, puffed up with arrogance and blinded by prejudice, stormed into a quiet lakeside cabin, certain they were catching a man breaking the community rules. What they didn't know was that the man inside wasn't trespassing at all. He owned the cabin and he wasn't alone. Sitting across the table from him was someone whose power reached far beyond their little HOA bylaws, the state attorney general. In that moment, their smug confidence shattered. What was supposed to be an easy show of authority was about to turn into a humiliating downfall that the entire community would never forget. The lakefront community had always carried an air of exclusivity. With its manicured lawns, gated entrances, and towering cabins tucked against the waterline, it was the kind of place where appearances were valued more than integrity. The HOA board prided itself on controlling every detail: what colors homes could be painted, what time residents could park their cars, even who was welcomed and who wasn't. For years, their power went unchallenged. And then, one spring afternoon, a new face appeared at the edge of the lake. A black man quietly stepping into a cabin that many assumed had been vacant for years. His name was Marcus Hall. To most, he seemed ordinary enough, calm, reserved, and polite, rarely seen outside except for fishing at dawn or walking the wooded trails in solitude. Yet his very presence irritated the HOA leadership. They whispered in meetings, pointing at his lack of fit with their community. They claimed his fishing poles made the dock look cluttered, his boat too modest for their standards, his visitors unfamiliar. What they never asked, because they thought they already knew, was who Marcus really was. The truth was far more than they could imagine. Marcus wasn't a renter nor a temporary guest. He was the rightful owner of the cabin, passed down through generations of his family who had worked and fought to preserve their claim to this piece of land long before the HOA ever existed. What's more, Marcus wasn't isolated or powerless. The quiet man they dismissed so easily had built powerful relationships through his professional life. Relationships that included people at the highest levels of state government. But the HOA didn't care about facts. To them, he was an intruder, someone to be forced out. And they were already plotting their next move. The tension began quietly, almost unnoticeably, like a ripple across the lake. At first, the HOA tried to mask their hostility with polite reminders slipped under Marcus's door. Notes about dock maintenance standards and fishing limitations appeared weekly, written in cold, clipped language that made it clear they were meant for him and no one else. Other residents never received such notices, even though their docks sagged and their boats leaked oil into the water. It didn't take Marcus long to realize these weren't genuine concerns, they were warnings. When that didn't work, the HOA escalated. One morning, Marcus found his boat rope cut loose, his small vessel drifting halfway into the lake. Another time, he returned from town to see the locks on his cabin door tampered with, as if someone had tried, and failed, to force their way inside. Neighbors he passed on the trail would avert their eyes, some giving curt nods while others whispered behind his back. Yet none of it shook him. Marcus had lived too long and seen too much to be intimidated by petty power plays. But the HOA wasn't done. At their monthly meeting behind closed doors, a small group of board members began to plot more direct action. They painted Marcus as a nuisance, someone who disrupted the culture of their community. Words like outsider and unfit were tossed around freely and no one objected. By the end of the meeting, their minds were made up. They would find a way to force him out regardless of the law. Meanwhile, Marcus went about his days with quiet determination. He repaired the aging cabin porch with his own hands, planted flowers along the walkway, and carried himself with dignity, even as harassment grew. But beneath that calm exterior, he was preparing. He knew the type of people he was dealing with, those who mistook arrogance for authority, who believed their influence stretched further than it really did. And so, he waited, saying little, letting them tighten their own noose. The breaking point came on a humid evening when the HOA president, emboldened by the whispers of her board, marched to Marcus's property with two other members at her side. They didn't knock or call out. Instead, they pushed through the doorframe with the confidence of people who believed rules didn't apply to them. To their minds, they were inspecting a nuisance property. To Marcus, it was a blatant violation, one they would regret more than they could imagine. Because inside the cabin that evening, Marcus wasn't alone. Papers covered the table. Legal documents spread neatly alongside maps of the lake. Across from him sat a man in a tailored suit, his expression sharp, his presence commanding. This wasn't a casual visitor, nor a friend stopping by for a drink. It was the state attorney general, in the middle of a private meeting with Marcus. The HOA members froze at the sight, caught mid-step, realizing too late they had intruded on something far larger than their petty vendetta. For the first time, Marcus looked up from his papers, his calm gaze locking onto theirs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of the room shifted instantly, and the air grew heavy with the realization that the game they had been playing was about to end. They had wanted power. They had wanted control, but what they had stumbled into was far more dangerous: accountability. And as the state attorney general slowly turned his head toward them, a silence fell so sharp it could slice through stone. The cabin wall seemed to close in as the HOA members realized where they stood. The air that had once felt thick with their own arrogance now pressed down on them like an invisible weight. The attorney general didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was louder than thunder, his stare sharper than any weapon they could have brought. The president of the HOA tried to steady herself, her usual commanding tone faltering as she stammered about routine inspections and community standards. But every word she uttered rang hollow, echoing like a guilty confession in the stillness of the room. The attorney general didn't even acknowledge her at first. He simply leaned back in his chair, folding his hands slowly as though giving them one last chance to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Marcus sat calmly at the table, watching. For weeks he had endured their harassment, their veiled threats, their open disdain. Now for the first time he didn't have to fight back alone. Justice had taken a seat right across from him, and the scales were no longer tipped against him. They were about to slam down on the very people who thought they ruled the lake. Finally, the attorney general spoke, his voice low but laced with authority that brooked no challenge. He asked the HOA members what legal grounds they believed gave them the right to enter this cabin without permission. None of them answered. The silence stretched heavier and heavier, until it felt like the room itself demanded a response. One of them shifted uncomfortably, another looked to the floor, and the president's confident mask cracked entirely. When the attorney general placed his hand on the stack of documents before him, the HOA members' eyes followed, their faces paling as they caught sight of official seals and signatures. These weren't just papers about fishing rights or property disputes. These were investigative reports, records of complaints, evidence of harassment, and signed affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed the HOA's discrimination firsthand. Every detail of their behavior was documented. Every abuse of power was noted. And in that moment it became clear that they hadn't just barged into a man's cabin. They had barged into the middle of their own undoing. The attorney general's next words cut through the silence like a blade. "You've not only violated this man's rights, you've exposed yourselves to the full weight of the law." The HOA members froze, their faces draining of color. For the first time, the power they had clung to so fiercely evaporated in an instant. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The weight of the attorney general's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. The HOA members, once so loud and controlling, sat frozen in their own silence. No excuses left, no rules to twist, no neighbors to intimidate. Their entire foundation of power crumbled in front of them, and the community they had long bullied would never see them the same again. Marcus, who had once been treated as though he didn't belong, finally stood taller than he ever had, not because he shouted, not because he retaliated, but because justice had revealed itself in the very place where he had been most disrespected. For the first time, he wasn't the man fighting to prove his worth. He was the man who had endured long enough for the truth to rise and defend him. The attorney general didn't stop at words. He outlined calmly and methodically what would happen next. A full investigation into the HOA's leadership, immediate suspension of their authority until the inquiry concluded, and, most importantly, legal action against those who had violated Marcus's rights through unlawful entry and repeated harassment. Every consequence was laid out with precision, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. The HOA president, once the embodiment of arrogance, sat in stunned silence. Her allies avoided eye contact, their shoulders sinking lower with every word. The image of control they had built for years dissolved into something pathetic. Leaders reduced to trespassers, bullies stripped of their shields. As the Attorney General stood, gathering the stack of evidence into his briefcase, he placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. It wasn't just reassurance, it was recognition. Recognition of a man who had endured more than he should have. Recognition that what Marcus had suffered was not just personal, it was systemic. And recognition that tonight marked a turning point not only for him, but for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed in the shadows of unjust authority. Word of the confrontation spread quickly across the lake community. Neighbors who had whispered in fear about the HOA's power now spoke openly, emboldened by what they had seen. Families who had felt cornered found relief, knowing that the system had finally turned its gaze toward those who abused it. And in the weeks that followed, the lake, once a place of intimidation, slowly transformed into a symbol of resilience and fairness. For Marcus, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It became a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is temporary, that the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually finds its way to the surface, and that no power, no title, and no group can stand forever on lies and prejudice. The HOA had thought they could barge into a man's life, unchallenged, forever. But in doing so, they barged straight into the consequences they never saw coming. And as for the community, they learned a lesson too. Leadership isn't about control, it's about justice. And when those in power forget that, their fall is not a matter of if, but when. So now the question lingers, not just for that HOA, but for anyone watching. When authority is abused, will you stay silent? Or will you stand where Marcus stood, firm, patient, and unshaken until justice finally speaks?